Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered. My name is Özge Ersoy. I'm the public programs lead at Asia Art Archive, and I'll be the moderator of today's talk. For those of you who are less familiar with Asia Art Archive, we are an independent, not-for-profit organization based in Hong Kong. We have a library and a collection of archival materials with a focus on recent art in Asia. And for the last 20 years, we've been working to contribute to a more generous, a more inclusive art history with our research, collections, programs, and publications. Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered is a 3-day program and a publication that look at the politics of posthumous archives. This project is Banu Cennetoğlu's artistic contribution to our exhibition, Portal Stories and Other Journeys. If you're in Hong Kong, I hope you had a chance to see the exhibition in person. If you haven't yet, please know that it's on view at Tai Kwun Contemporary and it's open until the 1st of August. First, I want to say a couple of words about this exhibition and share the context in which we are presenting Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered. Portal Stories and Other Journeys comes out of Asia Art Archive's research on a personal archive, the archive of the late Hong Kong artist Ha Bik Chuen, who was a self-taught sculptor and printmaker who documented 50 years of Hong Kong art history, covering over 3,500 exhibitions. And our team has worked on this archive for the past 7 years, creating an inventory, making a selective digitization, and inviting researchers and artists for collaborations. And some of these collaborations translated into the exhibition, including Banu Cennetoğlu's contribution. Banu is an artist based in Istanbul. We've been following her work for a very long time. And her work deals with the production, representation, and distribution of knowledge. She's worked with several archives and has a long-term interest in the question of how to present personal archives of people who are no longer with us. She joined our residency program in Hong Kong in 2019. And when she was here, our conversation centered around the idea of the artist's legacy. So we asked each other, how do we shape an artist's legacy? How do we control it? And how do we participate in it? And later, when we invited Banu to contribute to this exhibition, Portal Stories and Other Journeys, she proposed to develop a series of public programs around those questions. And here we are today. So starting with today, we will have 3 conversations and 2 film screenings, which will bring together artists and thinkers to discuss how we strive to recover and represent what is lost. And in the beginning, I said it's a 3-day program and a publication. So I also want to introduce you to the book that we published as part of this project. The book is titled The Orpheus Double Bind, and it features the English translation of an essay by the literary critic Nurdan Gürbilek. The essay itself, it looks at the author's dilemma in literature, how the author believes in and also doubts their own authority to recover the lost or to speak for the silent. This essay or this chapter has been a close companion to Banu since 2015, and we considered it as one of the contributors to the project itself. I should add that it's translated from Turkish to English by Victoria Rowe-Holbrook, and it's designed by Esen Karol. And when Esen, our designer, when we started talking about the book, she proposed this very small format, almost like similar to a passport, so that you can carry it with you and ideally close to your heart, like Banu has been doing for the last couple of years. And we'll speak about this essay today and also in the next 2 days. So, and today we'll have a conversation with Banu and Michelle Wong. Michelle is the curator of the exhibition Portals, Stories and Other Journeys. She's currently a PhD student in art history at the University of Hong Kong. And before that, she was a researcher at Asia Art Archive for 8 years, where she led the Ha Bik Chuen archive team. And in our conversations, we will focus on 2 very different projects that deal with the personal archives of individuals who are no longer with us. And we'll speak about some of the shared questions around legacy, authorship, and also formats of making these archives public. Very, very briefly, and we'll get into the details in a minute, Banu will share her experience around Gurbet's diary I Engraved My Heart into the Mountains, a work that she presented at Documenta 14 in 2017. And Michelle will speak about her research and curatorial work on Ha Bik Chuen's personal archive, an archive that she started working on as a researcher at Asia Art Archive, and she will continue to focus on this very archive for her PhD as well. So what I want to emphasize here is that for both of them, these are long-term engagements. And before I wrap up the introduction, I also want to take a moment to thank our partners and sponsors. So thank you so much, Tai Kwun Contemporary, for co-presenting this project, and especially Tobias Berger, Daniel Ho, Veronica Wang, David Chang, and Kylie Tung. And thank you, Hong Kong Arts Development Council, the Hong Kong Jockey Club Charities Trust, and Wing Foundation for supporting the Ha Bik Chuen Archive project in the previous years, and also to China Cam Group for supporting the research for this exhibition. And finally, a very short note on housekeeping. We'll have a conversation, three of us, for about an hour, and then we'll open the floor for your questions and your comments. So if you have any questions, please use Zoom's Q&A tool at any time during the conversation. And I also want to note that we are offering simultaneous interpretation from English to Cantonese. So if you would like to follow the conversation in Cantonese, please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to select your language. Banu and Michelle, I think I'll wrap up here. And I want to say that I'm the moderator today, but of course we've developed this project together. So I also want to thank both of you for this collaboration. And Banu, before I ask the first question, is there anything that you would like to add for the introduction?
Well, hello, first of all.
Hi.
Yes. I didn't know if I should get in or not, like in this moment. Well, before I do the first question, I would also like to thank you, I mean, to the team, but also particularly to you, Özge, because I know you're there as a moderator and as the lead program, the public program of AAA, and also the project coordinator. But without you, nothing of this would be possible. And we've been crafting this since a while. I mean, even before Asia Art Archive presence, and talking about these impossible questions with you. And also this program, really, it's been, yeah, it's a kind of a joint craft. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank to the team, but especially to you, heartfelt thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Before I start blushing, I think I'm going to start with the first question for you guys. And I think the first question that I would like to kick off the conversation with is actually about urgencies, right? I want to ask you about your initial urgency to work on the archive that you will be speaking about today. And it would be great if you could also speak about how you initially imagined this archive to be shared with the public when you first started looking at these related images too. And Banu, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Okay. Yes, I mean, as you mentioned, I will try to articulate all these difficult, almost impossible questions through my experience with Gurbet Ersoy's diary that I was closely involved before Documenta, and also towards the Documenta 14 exhibition in 2017. Just to give a brief introduction of who she is, or she was, and she is. Gurbet Ersoy was a journalist and a freedom fighter in Kurdish freedom movement. She was born in 1965 and killed in 1997. During last 2 years of her life, she kept a diary, an account of her armed struggle in the mountains. And she kept a diary until the day she was actually murdered. My urgency, I mean, this is, in order to understand that urgency, I have to give, within the incapacity of giving the context, because it's a very large context, but at least a short contextualization of Kurdish freedom movement within last 40 years of Turkey. We are talking about a heavily colonized and repressed community, where actually there is no freedom of speaking the mother tongue, there is no freedom of dissemination of distribution of local books or newspapers, there is no freedom of press, there is no freedom of expression, particularly exercised by state to the Kurdish community and also to the Kurdish literature and to the Kurdish language. There is an ongoing war, and still it's an ongoing war, and the last 40 years. There are moments in this conflict that the arms are kind of maybe for a while suspended. And so different attempts to have peace processes. Unfortunately, none of them really successfully settled. The last one was between 2013 and 15. There was where actually we could have access to certain kind of literature, material, testimonies on relatively mainstream platforms. What I want to say with this, because in a way the state was obscuring or trying to manipulate that part of the history very precisely and very strategically, where not only allowing the Kurdish people to express or to talk about their own history, but also to the Kurdish people to have access to that history. And this has been going on for like a really I'm talking about 4 decades, right? So during the last peace process between 2013 and 15, there was suddenly a possibility for us to access certain accounts, including the diaries of Kurdish fighters. And for me, this was like the trigger point, because I mean, obviously I'm trying to think and work around the politics of memory for some time now. And for me, the space of diary was very important and very unique in terms of intersection of public and private, especially within within this movement. Because in a way, the actors or the fighters of the movement, they were encouraged, even asked to keep diaries, because somehow this was the only way to resist against the repression of the state, which is trying to kind of craft their own historical version. So in a way, this was a way to resist and to struggle with their own memory, right? And to be able to transfer that account to upcoming generations. So it was about a kind of a future, trying to kind of, preserve the present for the future, for a kind of more maybe a relevant future. So I was interested in the space of diary of Gurbet Ersoy particularly, because she was a journalist. And actually, if she could write, and she could, she would be, maybe she wouldn't join the armed struggle. So my question was like, why someone not trained as a fighter had to join, unfortunately and inevitably, to this other kind of form of struggle. So I was interested to read her accounts as her testimonies during these very, very difficult 2 years. So the urgency came actually from a space as a Turkish person, somehow trying to understand my space within the silencing of that history, because somehow the suspension of that account or not being able to access to that account for years, and eventually after the peace processing, again, the book was confiscated and banned with a lot of other books. Somehow that silence was also illustrating somehow our complicity, within the kind of the larger community. So that's how I was trying to deal with that urgency, and also trying to find the different forms of communicating that urgency with the larger public, which will come back to that eventually. Yeah.
And we're also speaking about a book that was already available to the public, right? It was published in the 1990s, and then if you could say also a couple of words about, because it was available, and then I think we'll speak more about your contribution. But it would be great to emphasize this point as well, in my opinion.
Yes, I mean, she was killed in 1997, October, and the book and then the diary was published by a Kurdish publishing house in Germany, Mesopotamia, right after her decease in 1998. And then eventually with Aram Publishing House in 2014 during the peace talks or peace process. So I encountered it in 2014, and where I was actually trying to read a lot of different accounts and diaries from different from within the struggle, and then I particularly I become interested because of her journalistic, or because of her actually forced position to be a fighter almost. And so that's why that book was very important for me compared to other maybe fighters' diaries.
Okay, and then we're going to get back to that in a while. And Michelle, we can continue with you. If you could turn on your camera. I want to say that in Banu's case, she starts working on a book that was already published, and it's a testimony that we're talking about. And she was working on this as an individual artist. And in your case, you started working on the Ha Bik Chuen archive as part of the Asia Art Archive team. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but the archive was not accessible to many people at the time when you started working on it. So what can you tell us about how you started working on this archive, what your urgencies were, and what were the main questions for you?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Özge and Banu. I also feel compelled to give a little biographical detail of who Ha Bik Chuen was. I just feel apologize to people who've heard this many times. But Ha Bik Chuen was a Hong Kong-based artist who was born actually in Guangdong in 1925. And he came to Hong Kong via Macau in 1957 and sort of stayed in Hong Kong until the rest, sort of the end of his life in 2009. Like Özge, you were saying, he became a printmaker and a sculptor, but never went to art school. So he actually then started archiving or collecting stuff, organizing these materials, and then eventually get a camera and start taking pictures of exhibitions, and sort of in his sort of insatiable hunger to learn about art and sort of consume the visual world around him, built up this sort of huge collection of stuff that eventually became what sort of AAA calls the Ha Bik Chuen archive. Yeah, I think it's right to say that the urgency to work on this archive from the institution point of view at that time was very much about sort of addressing this sort of need to have resources to write Hong Kong's art history. And I think a lot has changed since then, but around 2013, I think a very dominant sort of lament was that Hong Kong has no art history, or it's very difficult to write Hong Kong art history. But I think, this is something that is very much contested because there were so many people working on art history, Hong Kong's art history, and Ha Bik Chuen's archive since becoming available. It's sort of proving that maybe it's not so much about the place not having an art history, but it's just the sources are invisible. But at that time, I was working on another project, which was with the Hong Kong Museum of Art, to create a set of oral history interviews with artists, art practitioners, galleries, dealers, educators at the time in the 60s and 70s who were active at the time, to ask them questions to, so tell us, how was the art ecology like at the time? All the while sort of knowing that Ha Bik Chuen had this collection of materials. And so the Ha Bik Chuen archive was sort of always like a dream project. Wouldn't it be nice if we can have 50 years worth of exhibition history material to work with to write the city's art history? And the great thing about working in an institution is that you don't work alone. And so there are people who we work together to put in applications, to start funding, applications to start the project going. And the funny thing was also, I had been to Ha Bik Chuen's archive when I was much younger, and that left an impression on me. I was a teenager and was sort of around 2008. But I had never thought that it would become sort of my professional life for so long, that I would keep working with this collection of stuff for so many years. Yeah, like when the Ha Bik Chuen family approached AAA with an invitation to say, would AAA be interested to work on this collection of materials? And I think we've been so lucky that the family fully not only understand, but hopes that the sharing of the materials, which was Ha Bik Chuen's will to begin with, that it can benefit much more people, or that curiosity and that sort of hunger for knowledge, for visuality would be then shared in different ways. And we've always sort of continued to benefit from that. And from then on, able to move the archive from its original location in Togwawan, as the collection of stuff also desperately needed to be rehomed. Because it's in a very old building and the ceiling started falling, and we're like, another rainy season, we may or may not have those things again. And that sort of started even more processes of moving the entire collection of stuff to a project space that we went on to run for another 5 years, which we've actually closed that space now. And I'm strangely very proud that, we've been able to find homes for this collection of material in multiple places, which was also the initial urgency as well, because it's such a large collection of materials that it is impossible for just one institution to take care of. So it's multiple sort of urgencies, I would say.
Thanks for that, Michelle. And for me, it's curious to have these two approaches with posthumous archives, be it through a personal or an institutional lens. But I think after all, regardless of the type of engagement, I believe we always bringing our own position, our own reading and perception when we look at these archival materials. And I would like to ask you, what were the materials that resonated with you immediately when you started working on these archives? And what were the materials that you approached with more of a hesitation or doubt? And Banu, I want to go back to you because with this whole project, Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered, we speak about the effort of reparation, right? This is something that Nurdan Gürbilek also talks about in the Orpheus double bind. And for me, just to very briefly recap, she writes that the authors, they face this dilemma, this double bind, while they try to give voice to the silent, they also question their own authority to represent the silence or to give form to absence. So I want to ask you, as an artist, how do you deal with this dilemma?
Well, I don't think there's a way to deal with this dilemma. I think it's impossible, but we try, we keep trying. I think that's like a kind of, that makes it also a double bind, right? I mean, there were lots of, when I start to look at this diary particularly, I mean, it's a very loaded constellation, I have to say. We are talking about 300 pages, but it opens and it closes and it cracks and it fears so many different parties. And also, I mean, Gurbet Ersoy was the a chief editor of a Turkish Kurdish daily. before she joined the armed struggle. And so for me, her account is also branches out to all the pressure and the repression of the freedom of press and freedom of speech, right? So when I was looking at this account, I was trying to read between lines and not just a kind of as a mere chronicle of a PKK guerrilla, So it actually offers, or it generates so many other layers of our contested history. So, and then the book, when you were saying, was accessible for some period in certain geography, including Europe and Germany, but there were lots of highs and lows, or moments and periods that it was available and not available. It was, confiscated and banned and then redistributed. And so in a way, this is also almost also a strategy that we don't manage to have a kind of a fluent access, thus a kind of a collective share and reading of the history, so they create this kind of tension around the distribution of accounts and testimonies. And then another of course, a large question I had, it was like my position as the artist, and also, despite the intention, going back to the Orpheus and not having this kind of Orphic position, right? So it would be terrible to have this reparative gaze, or trying to have a compensational aesthetics, or try to instrumentalize. Even that, if I don't want to, within art, it's very easy that we all know that you can end up with that position, right? Somehow, even that personally, we do everything not to go there. Somehow the context can envelope in such a, in such a manner that actually it might end up to be perceived as such. And so I was very scared and very doubtful, and to go to that kind of savor space, or I try to kind of be her voice, or try to interpret her voice, which was of course impossible, and it would be almost colonial. It would be almost like a violently kind of, I would repeat the colonial position, right? So continuously I was trying to find a form which actually could maybe the negotiate a space for her testimony, rather me talking instead of. So that's how the proposition, got a form. Ideally, I would kind of convince or negotiate documenta, which is, of course, it comes with a package as well, one of the largest exhibition, or the richest exhibition of visual arts, right? Like, globally speaking. So what would that mean to have the documenta as a companion in this journey? And also the important detail, when I start to work or to read or to have the Gurbet's diary with me, the book was available. But when actually I proposed what to do with this testimony, the book got confiscated with lots of other titles from the same publishing house, because it was the end of peace processing. So in a way, we start to deal also with an object which was not available for everyone, at least legally speaking, right? So that was also created lots of other cracks or doubts with the possible collaborators. So the idea was to publish Gurbet's account, only her words, through 2 daily newspapers in Germany and in Greece. They were the 2 venues or 2 cities that Documenta was going to take place for 5 months. So my proposition was like, she would go somehow return to the newspaper space, as she was not allowed to practice her profession before. So she would be a columnist, a guest columnist, or almost like a ghost columnist, and somehow share partially every day so that's how the proposition started. But then eventually, unfortunately, after 1 year of back and forth negotiations and conversations, in relation, of course, with also the political situation became tenser and tenser in Turkey, between Kurdish and Turkish state and the Kurdish community, between the PKK and Turkish army, between Germany and Turkey, and then eventually between Turkey and Greece. There was actually no partners available to publish this account, part of their editorial agenda.
And they were eager in the beginning of the process, and then things shifted, right?
Well, eager maybe is a large word. Interested, okay. Interested would be the word. But I mean, interested enough to sit on a table together and to try to negotiate. Of course, also the dynamics in Germany and in Greece are very different. Also towards the work and the presence of Kurdish freedom movement. So they have it's in general Europe, including Germany, they have a very hot and cold relationship based on their political agenda. So you never know actually if they condemn or they kind of tolerate. And I experienced actually one-to-one kind of hot and cold relation, and also made me think a lot. Such a book, such an account actually could trigger and generate so much fear. So suddenly my restlessness about my own position to instrumentalize it or to romanticize it, or to somehow her life becomes a subject matter of an art piece and then somehow, becomes kind of ready to be consumed. In a way, I had to postpone those ideas because any kind of form almost seemed impossible for a while, because of the way that many people or the potential public wanted to see this account as representation, as like a mere representation of this movement, and nobody was interested actually to look at the other possibilities that actually this piece of writing could offer. So it was about, Turkish-Kurdish war, and it was about terrorism. It was about the violence and armed struggle, and that's it, basically. And I was trying to actually destructure or decompress that within, including our own complicity and our own position and in it, but there was no way actually. It was too much. There was not enough space or coolness, to have a distance. Actually, it was too hot, and it's still too hot. I mean, the war is still going on. So that's also my question always, especially within arts. How do you talk about a kind of or representation of any kind of struggle within the struggle, or when the struggle is continuous, right? I think that's a very impossible yet important to think question.
And Banu, I think it would be great to go back to what the final artwork that you produce in response to the diary, and how it was exhibited, and how this form, the potential and also the limitations of this form as well. But before that, I actually want to go back to Michelle, because as Banu, you were speaking, I was also thinking about the title of this overall project, right? Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered, and how we are perhaps attracted to think and to work on posthumous archives, but also how this type of engagement eventually becomes like this baffling or uncomfortable thing, especially in regards to our own positions as authors or artists. And Michelle, I'm curious if you've gone through a similar dilemma around the representation, because the way that you've been approaching Ha's archive Of course, it's very different, but it would be great to hear your take on this. And also, I was also thinking, your position as a researcher, you are looking at this archive as a researcher, you are from a different generation than Ha Bik Chuen himself, and you will also continue to work on this archive now as an individual PhD candidate. And I'm wondering if you could speak also about these materials from the Ha archive that resonated with you immediately, and what materials that you've been more critical about or cannot wrap your head around.
Yeah. Well, I mean, before I go to talk about the actual materials, I'll tell you something that I was really uncomfortable even when I was working as part of AAA. But that's, you know, it's a much more sort of personal discomfort. If we can look at the image of the original Ha Bik Chuen studio, this was one of the rooms of Ha Bik Chuen's original studio, which, you know, is so full of color and in some ways so full of life, right? Because you could almost imagine that, like, what was this man doing there? Like, why was he so much of a hoarder? And if we go to the next image, when we moved the archive, well, we moved the collection into the project space where we ran out of for 5 years, the first thing that you see is the colors are lost. It became sort of just boxes. And I think, you know, I struggled with this sort of homogenization of the boxes, of the materials, like this discipline. And, you know, a good friend of mine used to say, like, the archive sometimes is there to be disciplined. And Ha Bik Chuen's collection of stuff was, you know, not to be disciplined. And I sort of constantly felt this sort of tug of war sort of throughout that many years. It's like, you know, constantly ask, am I doing the right thing to, of course I know I'm doing the right thing to sort of move it such to a different place so that eventually more people can use it. But in that process, what have we lost, right? What are the stories that are sort of slipping through our fingers, and how do we capture those, or how do we keep telling those in new ways such that the story continues to captivate? And, you know, Ha Bik Chuen was someone who sort of had a disregard of disciplinary boundaries, and how do we keep that sort of disobedience going on, even if we institutionally have to box these things up? How do we, at least intellectually and creatively, sort of refuse that? I think that was very important in the process of working it. I think the images are fine, thank you. And I'll speak a little more about how, I guess, as a researcher, I've tried to sort of attend to the different kinds of materials, and in some ways attend to the noise inside the archive so that it can help me disobey or sort of refuse this kind of disciplinary behavior, which, you know, is necessary to a certain extent. And I think that had become, you know, how I've developed this interest in sort of finding materials that would help contend the canon. I mean, for Hong Kong's art history, the canon there's no agreed canon. But there in some way is an agreed sort of quote unquote Western canon that sort of everyone looks to. And you find tons of these materials inside Ha Bik Chuen's archive, sort of rubbing shoulders with pornography, with Chinese traditional painting, all of that. So it has always been an interest of me to sort of continuously sort of try to make sense of why was he doing that? You know, why was this person who was an autodidact so keen and would have this kind of aspiration to want to insert himself into that canon? How do you write that story? And it becomes so much about the desire of the individual at the time, and what happens when the institution's desire is overlaid with an institution's desire. It's sort of constantly always butting heads. Are then the Picasso, the Matisse and whatnot monographs and all that catalogs not important to Hong Kong's art history or to us making sense of that art history? And I feel like Yeah, I don't know the answer. Hence the necessity of sort of actually taking the practice and the work forward into a different realm as well. But there are sort of particular materials that I've really enjoyed exploring, and to sort of look at Hong Kong as a cosmopolitan place, even as early as the 60s or the 70s, and how this sort of art historical materials also reflect that. And Ha Bik Chuen's archive does have some of these materials. So it's been really lovely to actually then see some materials of Manila in Hong Kong from that time, and then getting support to then go to Manila to see materials of Hong Kong and even artworks in the Ateneo Art Gallery that was not shown before, and to be able to help annotate that, and a few years later to see that as part of the permanent display in Ateneo. I think that was sort of like, you get such a high from looking at the sort of fast track of art history being rewritten. And I think I believe in the potential of that, but of a personal archive being shared in that sense. But I also sort of strongly believe that our own sort of continuous contention to dominant narratives and to sort of to question the way of writing history is necessary.
So far, we've been speaking about your, Banu?
Just want to, yes, yeah. I wanted, yeah, just because it's, I mean, I guess there's, when we kind of, you know, dive into a kind of somebody's, we call it archive, we call it compilation, constellation office, you know, and so if the person, we don't really work together with this person, right? There is always going to be something assumed, interpreted, and almost violated. And that's how I feel it, because we would never know actually how he would like to be presented, right? So in a way, the way it is, because I mean the archive is also involved, like, you know, the cutting and adding and subtracting and including, excluding, and so it carries, it's inevitable, it's by nature, it's very rigid and violent and authoritarian. And even like we approach with love and compassion, and sometimes even this is the most, maybe the dangerous thing, because there is this feeling or intention to do good, certain kind of justice, right? I mean, justice in a very large, as a very kind of large word here. If the person is not recognized enough, there is that kind of justice. If there is a kind of trying to kind of create a certain kind of awareness, you know, it also comes with lots of questions. Who are you to create that awareness? You know, like, I think there is no really a clear and clean position when somebody really deals with an archive. Doesn't matter if it's a Hong Kong artist or a freedom fighter. And we also take kind of deal with a material already edited as well, right? It comes with its own kind of frames and restrictions by family, or sometimes by the person mood, sometimes by the organization, and or for the public that the person wanted to be associated with. So it is, I really see it as a fragment, always as a fragment within that particular time and context. And it's very open to be something else when it's kind of going to be looked or perceived in a different context by somebody else, you know, or in a different geography or in a different political condition, which makes it quite interesting, actually, rather than something like the idea of an archive authority and fixed and kind of offers certain kind of truth. And so that's not possible, actually. We all know that.
And I think this is a great point to start talking about the presentation formats, right? Because so far we've been speaking about your own encounters with these archives. And I think I would like us to also talk about the encounter with the public that you worked on. And we know that each presentation format creates a different type of public. An exhibition reaches to a particular audience, a public talk gathers another type of audience, a film or a publication builds another type of audience with potential overlaps as well. But these might be also quite different from each other. So for you, my question is for you, what are the formats that you wanted to use to push the narrative format, to push the narrative forward, the public formats? And what were the moments that you felt that the format itself can also become violent, to go back to what Banu was talking about? And Banu, let's start with you, because you mentioned that initially the idea was to share the diary on the in the newspapers in Germany and Greece. And there was a major change of potential publics when you decided to, or you had to move the quote unquote the venue or the place of encounter to an artwork that will be on display in an exhibition. So can you speak about this transition?
Yes, maybe I can also ask if Samira could maybe share a few images of that the form. I mean, somehow, yeah. Oops, no, this is not. No, we can start with the stones. Yes, thank you, thank you. Yes, actually the proposition, that the initial proposition was not possible to happen and to process with. I was actually quite torn from different ways. Like first there was like, I think the time, it was like 4 months before the exhibition opening in Athens, and we knew that actually there would be no possibility of publishing her diary in daily newspapers. Hence, there was no venues, and also for me, both professionally, artistically, ethically, and personally, I didn't know what to do with this content. And my initial reaction was like lots of anger, to be honest, and also feeling of betraying Gurbet, Ersoy, which is, I think it's another also way, because Michelle also knows, after spending so much time with this person's words or work, and somehow there is this kind of weird closeness, you know, that you build with the person. So in a way, I was also feeling that I was not doing right. And again, I'm aware this also had this Orphic feeling, because this idea of justice, like doing justice to her, doing justice to her struggle, doing justice to this unfairness, which now with the distance, I feel like actually this is also very dangerous, that who am I to kind of do justice to that struggle. But I also didn't want to give up. And that also probably contains lots of questions around, well, stubbornness for sure, also not to kind of obey to the conditions, but also, of course, vanity, and also, you know, not like being absent maybe from the exhibitions, such an exhibition like Documenta 14. So there were lots of different dynamics there, and that somehow I wanted to go on. But also I was resisting to completely give a form which the work actually doesn't, was not going to represent, you know, that experience of last few years. So I ended up finding a solution with a material resistant to time and to light. Because the idea was like, how could I actually talk about this impossibility of distribution, impossibility of representation, without really creating a cry wall, but somehow the materiality could carry that impossibility. So then the diary, her accounts was transferred to the lithographic stones, 146 of them, according to the dates that actually she was entering. And they were actually also, they were slabs. So in a way, they were not as aesthetical stones to just carry the diary. They were slabs to be printed or to actually be used to have a lithographic print in case. And then, of course, the large question of monumentalization of this work, which was completely unforeseen, because the idea of the ephemeral distribution within a newspaper, and we don't know what people do with it as a continuous kind of appearance in everyday life and disruption, even, like, because I was interested to the disruption of the newspaper, their editorial agenda, the disruption of the public, whatever we call, like in their breakfast table, or if they read, somehow her presence, for me, her resistance, or her disobedient presence could be a disruption to everyday reality. But then suddenly we were together with these 2 tons of stones, 145 stones, and also not conveying the content. They were just reverse transferred content with the potentiality and the capacity to be printed one day. But of course, it's a monument as well. So the public, it was impossible for the public, particularly talking about the document, or the audience who will kind of, fuss to this library, it would be impossible to understand the nuance of all these phases, right? And I also didn't want to kind of narrate all the different phases. But then, of course, there's a moment that the work can be reduced to this conflict, or to the life story of that person, right? Of the Gurbet Ersoy, which actually I was trying to avoid at the beginning and try to open up for larger questions. But because of this condensed form, and I think now it functions rather as a sculptural, monumental sculpture even for her, and also difficult to kind of open up other questions about representation and about this ongoing conflict. Actually, we can all have different positions, not only even based on the Turkish ones, but also regionally, and of course, inevitably also includes the European region. So that's why when the work travels now, it's in US, in St. Louis, and it will travel to Switzerland. It might travel to other places. So every time, I question a lot, like how to contextualize that, this narrative based on actually the local public that the work will be encountered to, right? So there is no fixed public, there is no fixed narration. And so it's kind of, despite this weight and the kind of very kind of monumental appearance, I think it's a very, it carries a lot of questions in flux, I can say.
And Banu, it's great that you actually mentioned about the afterlife of the work following the end of Documenta 14. And you talked about that, you've been trying to deal with the way in which you communicate the proposition of the work, and the risk of reducing the artwork to the life story of a person or a very specific political issue. Could you give us an example of a type of a conversation or type of a negotiation that you had to do with one of the institutions? We don't necessarily have to give a very specific name, but if there were questions raised by the institution, or the questions that you had to raise to the institution itself, it would be great if you can just give us an example.
Well, not an example, but like it's an ongoing negotiation, I have to say, because I mean there are different reasons for that. I mean, one of those is like, for certain people, what she represents. I mean, she represents for different publics different things, right? For Kurdish community, she has another meaning, and for Turkish community, certain kind of Turkish community, she has a different meaning, and for European public, somehow engage with those questions, she would have a different resonance. So I guess as artists, when we come, when we kind of bring our narrative that we want to share through them, with this certain kind of negotiations, it's very important that the actors of that negotiation, how are they connected to those questions? Because if it is only about facilitating, because they want to just make this artwork happen, and in general, the risk that they want to take is very low, because they have to really think about different parties, different risk managements, and everyone's threshold for risk and fear is also very different, right? So when the fear is difficult to kind of is difficult to describe, it's safer. But when the risk and the fear is closer, and it starts to be on everyday newspaper, then they start to question, is this art is the right place actually to raise those questions? What happens if something happens to the venue, or to one of the artists, or if somebody attacks? Because it somehow shows that art has this very gestural and representational intention and capacity. And when the moment requires more involvement and also contains more risks, for certain people, there is maybe an understandable kind of doubt and also cautiousness start. And I think maybe a good example is this. How to explain this in a short version. In documenta, I had also another work, which was a graffiti from the Athens Technical University, and the graffiti reads as such: "Being safe is scary." And so when I was working with the Being Safe is Scary on trying to mount it on the facade of Fredericianum, I was simultaneously working with the Gurbet possible distribution with the newspapers. And when things start to get entangled and quite difficult, eventually when we found Gurbet's library, we placed the Gurbet's library at Gennadius Library in Athens, in this very secretive garden, I have to say, that was a kind of process to find it. There was a kind of certain relief by everyone, because then the risk that actually this work could trigger somehow they thought it was under control. On the other side, I did the Being Safe is Scary was carried to the facade of Fredericianum, which is like, the one of the most visited venue of castle, and especially during documenta is like the kind of, the landmark, but somehow this work was about, Being Safe is Scary was not at all about Gurbet. It was an anonymous graffiti. I assume it was written one of someone who was hosted by the university as the part of the migrant community. And this is also 2006, when there was this illegal European-Turkey refugee deal. And so there was lots of kind of tension between Turkey and Greece in terms of, sending back processes. But when this sentence was on the Fredericianum, the German press didn't want to see, or German public not only press. Can we go to the image of the actual Fredericianum with the text? Yes. It was very interesting because in one way we were trying to hide Gurbet at Gennadius' garden, and everyone was relieved about that. And on the other side, the German public didn't want to at all think about the notion of safety. And shortly before, Angela Merkel actually was very proud of the very safe and secure windows of Germany, but they didn't want to think about the violence around the safety measures and the refugee situation, etc. But they wanted to think about this sentence through the lens of Turkish-Kurdish conflict, because somehow for them, I think, and for many of us, when we kind of corner a situation that we are not comfortable with, and then we project it to other people, then it's nice, it's easier and it's nicer to deal with it, right? So this was nothing to do with the safety and security issues and problems in Europe or in Germany, but it was about like very unsafe war between Turkey and Turkish state and Kurdish people. So, and for me, this was really a very interesting kind of, the observation of how public could shape the work. And then now when you Google, you will see lots of similar news, and which has nothing to do with the origin, intention, or representation, or the questions of the work. Yeah, I guess could be that's.
Thank you, Banu. And I want to ask Michelle about what the exhibition format offers as well, because I think there are many different ways in which we've been making Ha Bik Chuen's archive accessible to the public or open to the public. So the archive itself, the digital version, is accessible online on the website. Michelle, you previously wrote about the archive for several publications with its programs around it. So I want to ask you about the exhibition in particular. Because for me, for instance, the exciting part is that there are artist commissions, there are artist responses. So we have more speculative readings about or around the archive itself. But as Banu was saying, sometimes the exhibition doesn't necessarily relay all the nuances that we would like to talk about in the process, right? Banu was saying we use exhibitions to try to crack open, these nuances and these discussions about the work, about the archive in particular, and also around the questions of archives, authority, representation in general. So I'm wondering what your expectations were from the exhibition, and what did the exhibition format has offered compared to the other forms of presentation so far.
Maybe we can walk through how the exhibition looks like a little bit while I sort of talk. Yeah, I think, if you look at the exhibition format here, and this is a sort of an installation shot of it, that, it's open plan, we've selected, out of 600 boxes of stuff, sort of these, I guess, 10 moments or 10 sets, which I call sets, which, I usually call them sort of moments of clarity. While you're swimming in the sea of information, sometimes your lens comes into focus and you sort of see things quite clearly. I, was also thinking that these presentations of the sets might also be sort of a way to sort of pack a punch at whoever is viewing the exhibition or sort of engaging with the archive, where you actually see and experience sort of in multiple levels what looking into an archive can do to your existing understanding of certain things, or sort of discovering things that you didn't even know before. But I think what is most exciting about working on an exhibition in Tai Kwun in Hong Kong with Ha Bik Chuen's archive is actually I've been able to explore much more in an exhibitionary form, sort of the affective register of working with an archive, or sort of sharing that aspect of being with an archive, with an audience. And you know, the public, I always like, what is a public, right? I think it's a construct with whoever comes in. And you can zoom into sort of different textures, and this work is by Rux, where you actually see sort of, it's just textures of dried ink, which, you know, goes back to how Rux was seeing an image of a dried ink plate in Ha Bik Chuen's archive. And I think these are very different from what some audience may expect from an archive or an exhibition departing from an archive, where you might expect the exhibition to impart knowledge, to sort of organize information. I mean, we also do some of that within the exhibition. But I think what ended up sort of really occupying a lot of my headspace working on this exhibition is how do you make sure that affective encounter, which was so part and parcel of all of our conversations, whether it's with the family, with the different artists, with our colleagues and friends, how do we retain or even sort of amplify some of that? And this is also a favorite image of mine, you know, for those of us who work in Hong Kong sort of art and culture, this half fish, half person figure is sort of like a star in Hong Kong art history, which actually is a fictional character, where another curator in 1998, Oscar Ho, at the Cups of the Handover, invented sort of almost as a way, as a metaphor to speak about the handover. And of course, you know, us who come later, we only sort of hear about as rumors. A lot of us have not seen any actual sculpture or any reproduction of the exhibition documentation until quite recently. So an exhibition allows us to then sort of also restage this encounter of, you know, encountering the shadow of something that is probably very important, but you don't know what yet. And I spoke to someone this morning, and she said, oh, you know, I've gone back to sort of see the exhibition 3 times just because I want to see how I would encounter this scene differently. And for me, that I think then this is what I would like to see an exhibition that departs from an archive do, because it shows you, it makes you think about, what if I go there again and do it in a different way? How would I tell the same story in a different way? Would that story still be the same story? And then to push it a little forward, what kind of agency do I have then as a visitor? And yeah, and this is the work by Walid Rad, where you see sort of many little mini Ha Bik Chuens sort of stacked up in the different boxes. And I think, you know, it's also creating this experience of as an exhibition goer, you're in this space where there is no linear journey, but you are aware that you are a protagonist. As a visitor, you are there to complete the set that you are in. And I think that I feel mirrors how I've always navigated an archive. It's like no one tells me what to do, or I have to figure out what questions as a researcher or as a curious individual, as someone who's committed to an intellectual life, to a creative life, what I would like to see. And of course, then you navigate different sort of limitations, whether it's institutional, personal, time, resources. But I think it's in that toggling that that tension is created. And with tension, then you can create new things. Yeah, so that's how I feel about sort of making an exhibition. Oh, I must speak about this particular entry. You know, often we think about, oh, the archive is dispersed. It has gone to different places now. But I think this zine, which actually is a comprehensive book list of Ha Bik Chuen's personal library, and there are over 5,000 volumes in this library. And we are able to compile this book list with our colleagues Samantha and Stephen, precisely because there are people who have taken every single book from this 5,000 strong personal library. And so now this library that belonged to one person, belonged to Ha Bik Chuen, now have a new life, have many different new lives as part of different people's personal library. And I think this is such a transformation that I don't even have words how to describe it. And the fact that it is a small, well, an A4 size sort of zine that has no cover and has no ending, because the end and the beginning is where you decide to open it or close it. I find that actually is a very apt way of thinking about how I wish to work with an archive.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And I should add that the strength of the exhibition for me is that if you move these works outside of Hong Kong, they also have the potential to ask these larger questions around archives, authorities, representations, and access, because definitely we do start with a Hong Kong history. But for me, going back to what Banu was talking about, they're not necessarily limited with only to speak about a very particular place, because especially the way that you created these configurations of the archive or the selection of the archive, as well as the artist's works, they do say, they go beyond that point. But at this point, I'm also aware of time, because we have around 18 minutes before we wrap up. I have many more questions for you, even if we've been speaking for a long time. But I actually want to go to the Q&A and invite our audience members to ask their questions if they have any questions. And to begin with, I would like to read a comment by Jean Richard, who's joining us from Lausanne. And Banu and Michelle, if you would like to comment on this, I would leave it to you. But first, I would like to read it out loud. Archive is by definition fragmentary and is made of constructed materials as a creation like fiction. Of course, archive or testimony is charged by a link or reference to reality, but the work is already a mediated one. Just to be just means to reveal and present the work, to fight against the invisibility and invisibility strategies and stigmatization. And he ends, what is important is to break the silence around testimony and the strength of such testimony, allowing the voice to speak out and to give it space and resonance. I'm wondering if you have immediate thoughts about Jean Richard's comment. Who would like to take this?
Well, I mean, thank you, Jean, by the way. I mean, I know him, and I can try to say a few words. Hopefully we will collaborate soon for Gurbet's diary. Yes, because actually this is exactly what also I share your thoughts, but also I'm trying to sometimes, this is very specific because Jean Richard, if I might say, is coming from a literature world, so and publishing house, but sometimes within the art world, certain kind of strategies or authorship or can create or can actually appropriate the share of the silent. You know, that's also like how we kind of shape these questions and this program. So in a way, I'm also interested in order to continue the struggle, or in order to continue to somehow within the incapacity, the resistance. Maybe within arts, we should try new strategies of divorce also our authorship. Right. I mean, there are moments we don't also have to own of the authorship, or to become the owner for every piece of art, or not everything has to be a piece of work, right? So what I see is there are different layers of continuity and engagement within this kind of very difficult, entangled positions between the content that we want to talk about, between the solidarity we want to show to the artistic voice that we want to preserve, and institutional collaborations that we want to have. So in a way, and also, I mean, we live in a world that there is, you know, it's not specific to certain geographies. There is this kind of decay that we are kind of, you know, sometimes very fast, sometimes very slowly that we are in. How actually we can rethink our positions, you know, when especially we are trying, or we are pretending sometimes to kind of, you know, interpret the history again, and you know, how we can rethink our responsibility and our positions, you know, maybe not necessarily for the past, but for the present, and definitely for the future. You know, so we are not maybe responsible of what happened in the past, although I would doubt that, but we are, I mean, I think it belongs to James Baldwin. We are definitely responsible what we can and what we can't now. So that's somehow, I also think it's important to reconsider our positions, especially when we try to look at the archives or constellations or these kind of juxtapositions.
Thank you, Banu. Michelle, would you like to respond to Jean-Richard's comment, or do you have any questions for Banu?
I can do a little bit of both. One of the things that, yeah, as much as the archive is a fragment, like it's fragmentary, and sort of one never can deal with it as sort of comprehensive. I'm recalling one of the metaphors that I found very, very productive over the years is to actually think of working with the collection of materials as being sailing in a sea while you're trying to build a compass, or sort of trying to play a piece of music while the score is being written. And there's a certain, you know, instability in doing that, because there's no set path, and you're constantly sort of feeling the contours and the boundaries of the stuff that you're working with, even of your own desires, of the questions that you are asking. But for me, there's something always that's just sort of just pure discovery, and sort of pure curiosity, as much as we're dealing with the lack, dealing with grief. You know, for every personal archive of a deceased person means there is a grieving process that's ongoing. But I somehow find that this sort of trying to build a compass while you are sailing in a sea has been a really inspiring sort of guiding principle that I sort of really hope to keep working on, to follow as well. Which leads me to a question to Banu, because when Özge opened tonight our conversation, she mentioned that you keep Nurdan's text sort of close to your heart, and that has sort of informed how that entire publication, the size of it, the excerpt of it, because, you know, it's a big book, but we've sort of been able to translate a small part of it. And I've always been curious to ask, you know, why do you keep that particular section? And I heard you don't keep the entire book, but that particular section. I really want to know.
Yes, it's here. I show you. I was violently also torn from the binding, that particular chapter with the Orpheus double bind. I mean, years ago. So it traveled with me last 6 years, all over the place. Why this chapter?
Yeah.
Well, you read the text.
Yeah.
I mean, well, it is somehow, it performed as my compass. over, like, especially, like, reminded me actually my space, my incapacity, the impossibility of testimony, especially by proxy. It kind of made me think also, and then didn't somehow made a boundary of being aware of my limited position. That's how I see this text. I mean, she's an amazing writer with kind of, you know, this kind of meticulous collages of different writers and artists, that how they deal with this darkness, right? With this, sometimes is it about the writer, or is it about the subject of the writing, or is it really about this kind of redemptive gaze, right? This is something that she's been trying to kind of the excerpt from different artists and writers. So for me, this text is a constant reminder of the impossibility of the testimony, and somehow, but yet one has to keep trying. Yeah. Sorry, did I answer?
Mm.
Not well.
No, you did. You did. So I think everyone keeps a little bit of a, like, a personal Bible of some sort.
Yes, and I mean, she's and also, I mean, we with Özge, we went back to her writing very often when we were talking and conversing and crafting this program. So it was also an excuse to be able to translate and make it available for other kind of public, and you know, and not to kind of keep her only on our hearts, but also for other pockets as well. Yeah.
And just to remind everyone, in the beginning of the talk, Susanna has shared the link to the PDF version of the publication. And Susanna, if you don't mind, if you could reshare it, that would be great for some of the audience members who joined us a little bit later in the process. So it's available, the publication is available on AA's website right now. And we've just received the first batch of the hard copies, and we'll bring some copies to us, with us to the second session tomorrow. And here I would like to remind our audience members, if you do have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A tool. I believe Emily Verla-Bovino is raising her hand. Emily, do you mind typing your question so that we could all see it, please? Oh, accident. Okay, so thanks for joining us, Emily. So perhaps I will take this opportunity to ask one more question, if that is fine with you, Banu and Michelle. But if you have other questions for each other, we can also continue with that. Yeah?
Fine.
Okay, because I think I'd like to go back to something that Michelle was talking about a couple of minutes ago, the idea that this becomes a grieving process, right? How this effort at reparation, or this effort to make this type of archives public, can be a tool for mourning for the deceased ones. So I'm wondering your thoughts about that. Do they have the power to recuperate this lost person, or is it just a way to maintain a relationship with this person that we're talking about? It's a big question.
Michelle, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, of course, there is the legacy of the individual. But I think what, how do I even say this? I think what Ha Bik Chuen's archive will do and can do, thinking about it now, is, or knowing what has happened in the past few years in Hong Kong, I know that it will perform very differently from 2013. or even from 2015 with the umbrella movement. And I think I like to think that there is a very different understanding of historicity with sort of the entire sort of generation, including myself. I think there is a sort of continuous change of what it means to know your history and to know how you want to write it and therefore how you write it. And I think that is continuously changing, and I hope it's one that is towards criticality and sort of possible radical change, even if it's just intellectual change. I have sort of a lot of faith in that because I also think it's a very important process. So in terms of sort of what it means for sort of collectivity and grieving, I think it's not just grief of one family, but I think it's also grieving of how a city is changing and what it means to be a generation that is sort of living with this now. Yeah, I think that is sort of constantly being written. And I mean, the history surprises you, right? The present surprises you. And so I think yeah, as much as it seems a little depressing, but I think there are possible ways to sort of keep working at it. And this awareness of historicity, like I said, can only be strength.
Banu?
Well, this is a very large question for me. I mean, it requires another session.
We wanted to end with a bang.
Yeah. I mean, the whole question and notion of grief and mourning, especially in this context of where the state violence is exercised on daily basis, and where our decades of ungrievable bodies, and that's like a part of their policy. They don't want that the bodies that people grieve for their lost ones. So I think it's a very different context, right? And for me, maybe some years ago, I was feeling more close to this very personal kind of space where actually I was questioning my, individual and singular capacity of mourning for my family, and also for the ones that I don't know, including, in person, right? Like Gurbet and many others that actually, but then eventually I came up with this kind of a bit distance to this idea that I don't want to sentimentalize that, right? And when this kind of a potential for this collective mourning actually become this very kind of self-constructed sentimentality, right? I mean, this is very dangerous, and somehow, like, you feel good, your conscience, and you're compassionate. But I think there are lots of questions about that. What capacity do compassion have for any kind of political transformation? And the transformation somehow has to start personally, right? And that crack has to happen inside, and then hence there is a potential to become a for the whole society and a public one. But that doesn't mean that kind of the different spaces of who I am and who she is gonna be like become a merge, and we're gonna be like one body and in harmony, and no, I think we have to aware actually that tension will be there always, but that doesn't mean that I can't mourn collectively for that actually violent history, and if I think that's it becomes a really a genuine one, it has the capacity for transformation and really change things, rather than we kind of as the dominant the rhetoric ones that somehow certain people deserve to be killed or die and in such a way that, because, you know, and then we just have to watch, and we don't feel like we have a certain, you know, any kind of role or power or complicity in this exercise. So I believe that transformative power of mourning, but it's also, we have to be very cautious with the capacity of sentimentalization and the compassion.
Thank you, Banu. I think this is a great point to end today's session. Banu and Michelle, thank you so much for the conversation today. And tomorrow we will continue with a film screening for the second session of Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered. And the film screening is The Proposal by Jill Magid. And after the screening, artist Jill Magid is going to join us for a conversation. If you're in Hong Kong, please join us at JC Cube at Tai Kwun to watch the film and the online conversation together. And if you are outside of Hong Kong, please register to the event if you would like to receive the online streaming link for the film and also the Zoom details for the conversation. I want to thank tremendously to our interpreter, Yoning, for providing the simultaneous interpretation today. And also my colleagues from Asia Art Archive who are working tirelessly behind the scenes. So thank you very much, Garfield, Rebecca, Samira, and Susanna. And I hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.